What if Donald Trump and Israel win the explosions but lose the war? At first glance, that sounds like a contradiction. When people watch wars unfold on television or scroll through the updates on their phones, the scoreboard seems obvious. Missiles hit targets, buildings collapse, military bases are destroyed, enemy weapons are eliminated. One side strikes harder than the other. To most observers, that looks like victory. But war has always contained a deeper layer that is far less visible than explosions, and that deeper layer determines whether a conflict actually achieves its purpose. Most people confuse military victory with strategic victory. A military victory is simple to understand. It means superior firepower, better weapons, more effective strikes, and more damage inflicted on the enemy's infrastructure. It is measured in destroyed missile sites, collapsed command centers, intercepted rockets, and eliminated equipment. Those things are visible. They produce dramatic images. They generate headlines. But a strategic victory is something very different. A strategic victory means that the political objective, the reason the war began in the first place, has actually been achieved. It means the situation that justified the conflict has been resolved in a way that creates a stable outcome. And history shows that these two kinds of victory do not always move in the same direction. A country can dominate militarily and still fail strategically. In fact, some of the most powerful nations in history have experienced exactly that paradox. The military wins battle after battle, demonstrating overwhelming strength, yet the larger objective quietly slips out of reach. Why does that happen? Because war is not just about destroying things. War is about changing behavior, reshaping incentives, and forcing political outcomes. And those outcomes do not always respond to military pressure in predictable ways. This is why the question surrounding the current conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran is more complicated than it appears. The question is not simply whether American or Israeli forces can strike targets effectively. Of course they can. The real question is whether those strikes are moving the conflict closer to a clearly defined strategic outcome. And that is where things begin to get slippery, because the objectives surrounding this conflict seem to shift depending on the moment you examine them. At first, the stated goal appears straightforward: stop Iran's missile threat. That is a concrete objective. Missiles represent a direct military danger. Destroying missile infrastructure or reducing Iran's ability to launch them could theoretically reduce that threat. But then the objective expands. Now the discussion is about crippling Iran's broader military capacity. Then the conversation moves again. Now the focus becomes eliminating the nuclear threat, preventing Iran from developing or deploying nuclear weapons in the future. And then the narrative shifts once more. Suddenly, a new measure of success appears. Missile attacks are down by 90%. That statistic sounds impressive on the surface. It suggests that the military campaign has significantly reduced Iran's ability to retaliate. Headlines can easily present it as proof that the strategy is working. But if you pause for a moment and examine the logic carefully, something unusual appears. Before the war began, the number of Iranian missiles launched because of this war was 0. That is the original baseline, which means the metric being used to demonstrate success is relative to the escalation that followed the bombing campaign itself. In other words, the argument becomes, yes, missile attacks surged after the conflict began, but now they are only a fraction of what they were at the peak of retaliation. From a purely statistical perspective, that can be true, but from a strategic perspective, it creates a complicated question. If the proof of success is that retaliation has decreased after an escalation that your own military actions triggered, then the metric becomes difficult to interpret as a clear victory. In physics, when you run an experiment, you have to be careful about feedback loops. If your experiment creates the very phenomenon you later claim to be reducing, the interpretation of your results becomes far less straightforward. The same caution applies to war. If a military campaign produces a surge in retaliation, and then the reduction of that retaliation becomes the metric of success, the strategic meaning becomes ambiguous. None of this means the strikes themselves are ineffective. Military operations can absolutely destroy infrastructure, eliminate weapon systems, and disrupt command structures, but destruction alone does not define success. Success requires a clear connection between military action and the political outcome that justified it. And this is where the conversation becomes more complicated. Because the deeper problem in many conflicts is not the lack of military power. The deeper problem is the absence of a clearly defined end state. What exactly does winning look like? Is it the complete elimination of Iran's missile capabilities? Is it the permanent dismantling of nuclear infrastructure? Is it deterrence, convincing Iran that retaliation will be too costly in the future? Or is it something more modest, like temporarily degrading military capacity and buying time? Each of those possibilities represents a very different definition of victory, and each of them requires a very different level of effort, time, and political commitment. The difficulty begins when those definitions are not clearly established at the start of the conflict, because when the objective remains vague, the meaning of success becomes flexible. Military progress can be interpreted in many different ways depending on which objective is emphasized at any given moment. Destroy a missile base, and it can be described as reducing immediate threats. Disrupt a nuclear facility, and it can be framed as delaying long-term weapons development. Reduce retaliatory attacks, and it can be presented as restoring deterrence. But if the ultimate objective is never clearly articulated, the conflict risks drifting from one justification to another. And strategic drift is one of the most dangerous patterns in modern warfare. When the objective keeps moving, it becomes difficult to determine when the mission has actually been accomplished. And when the mission cannot be clearly defined, it becomes even harder to determine when the conflict should end. This is not a new problem. Military history is filled with examples of powerful countries that achieved impressive battlefield results but struggled to translate those results into lasting political outcomes. The challenge is not whether a military can strike effectively. The challenge is whether those strikes are connected to a strategy that leads somewhere specific, because explosions alone do not define victory. Strategy does. And when strategy becomes unclear, even the most dramatic military successes can begin to look less like progress and more like motion. That is why the most important question in this conflict is not about firepower. The United States and Israel clearly possess overwhelming military capabilities. The more difficult question is something else entirely. What happens if the explosions succeed, but the strategy behind them never clearly defines what winning actually means? One of the most common patterns in modern warfare is something that does not appear immediately. At the beginning of a conflict, the objective usually sounds clear and focused. Leaders explain the reason for action, the mission is defined, the goals appear achievable. But wars rarely stay within the boundaries that were announced at the start. As events unfold, objectives begin to shift. Sometimes the shift is subtle. Sometimes it happens slowly enough that most people do not notice it at first. But over time, the original goal becomes harder to recognize. This phenomenon has a name in military and political circles: mission creep. Mission creep occurs when a conflict gradually expands beyond its original objective. New goals are introduced, old ones are quietly modified, the scope of the operation grows, and the definition of victory becomes less precise. It does not necessarily happen because of deception. More often, it happens because reality interferes with plans. Wars generate consequences that cannot be perfectly predicted. Retaliation escalates, alliances shift, domestic political pressure increases, international reactions change the diplomatic landscape. Each development forces leaders to adjust their messaging and their expectations, and that is where the strategic picture becomes complicated. At the start of a conflict, leaders often describe a specific threat that must be addressed. In the case of tensions involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, one of the earliest arguments focuses on Iran's missile capabilities. Missiles represent an immediate danger. They can strike cities, military installations, and civilian infrastructure. Reducing that threat seems like a clear and understandable objective. But once military action begins, the conversation often expands. Now the discussion includes broader military capacity, not just missiles, but command centers, training facilities, logistics networks, and production infrastructure. Then the narrative expands again. Attention shifts toward the nuclear question. Preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons becomes a central theme. That objective is far more complex than destroying missile launchers. Nuclear programs involve scientific expertise, distributed facilities, hidden research, and long-term technological development. Even large-scale bombing campaigns may slow such programs rather than eliminate them entirely. This is where the strategic bar rises dramatically. Eliminating a nuclear threat is not the same as degrading a missile system. It requires deeper and more sustained disruption, and even then the outcome may remain uncertain. So the definition of success adjusts once more. Instead of total elimination, the language shifts toward degradation. Capabilities are degraded, infrastructure is degraded, timelines are delayed. The emphasis moves from permanent solutions to temporary advantages. At this stage, the definition of victory becomes harder to measure. If the goal is total elimination, success can be judged clearly. Either the capability exists or it does not. But if the goal becomes degradation, delay, or deterrence, the evaluation becomes more subjective. How much degradation counts as success? How long must a program be delayed? How strong must deterrence be before the objective is considered achieved? These questions do not have precise answers, and when answers become ambiguous, the narrative surrounding the conflict begins to shift towards statistics that appear to demonstrate progress. For example, the claim that missile attacks have dropped dramatically. Such numbers may be accurate. Military pressure can absolutely disrupt operations and reduce the frequency of retaliation. But statistics alone do not necessarily resolve the strategic question, because the deeper issue remains unchanged. What exactly is the war supposed to accomplish? Is the objective the complete removal of a threat, or is the objective the management of that threat? Those are fundamentally different goals. Removing a threat suggests a decisive end state. Managing a threat suggests an ongoing process. And that difference matters enormously when it comes to how long a conflict continues and how it ultimately ends. Another complication emerges from the fact that adversaries adapt. Iran has spent decades anticipating the possibility of airstrikes and military pressure. Its missile systems and infrastructure are designed to survive disruption. Facilities are dispersed. Capabilities are distributed across multiple locations. That means even successful strikes may not produce the kind of immediate and total results that political rhetoric sometimes implies. Instead, the conflict becomes a contest of endurance. One side attempts to degrade capabilities faster than the other side can rebuild or adapt. But endurance conflicts rarely produce clean conclusions. They produce cycles: strike, retaliation, disruption, recovery. Each cycle creates new pressures and new incentives for escalation or restraint. And that leads to another strategic challenge: time. Short wars are politically manageable. They have a clear beginning, dramatic moments of action, and a defined end. Governments can present them as decisive responses to threats. The public can process them as events with a narrative arc: crisis, action, resolution. But long wars behave very differently. The longer a conflict continues, the more variables enter the equation. Civilian casualties begin to accumulate. Infrastructure failures spread beyond military targets. Diplomatic pressure intensifies. Allies begin asking harder questions. Domestic political support begins to fluctuate. War stops being a contained military operation and becomes a political environment.
And that is where strategy becomes more important than firepower. Because ultimately, wars are not fought to destroy things, they are fought to produce political outcomes. Explosions may destroy infrastructure, missiles may eliminate launch sites, airstrikes may cripple command centers, but none of those actions by themselves constitute victory. Victory requires a condition, a new reality in which the objectives that justified the war have been achieved and the political environment has stabilized enough for the war to end. Without that transition from military action to political outcome, wars drift. And strategic drift is one of the most dangerous phenomena in international conflict. Drift occurs when military operations continue successfully at the tactical level, but the broader purpose becomes increasingly unclear. Targets are struck, operations expand, retaliations occur, new justifications emerge, but the war begins to move forward without a clearly visible destination. This is where public perception begins to change. At the beginning of a conflict, attention focuses on capability. Can the military strike effectively? For the United States and Israel, that question is not particularly controversial. Both possess overwhelming technological superiority, intelligence capabilities, and military infrastructure. They can hit targets with extraordinary precision and destructive force. But as time passes, the question evolves. The issue stops being whether they can strike harder. The issue becomes whether striking harder actually moves the situation toward resolution. And that distinction matters enormously, because military dominance does not automatically translate to strategic clarity. History has demonstrated this repeatedly. Powerful nations often possess the ability to destroy enormous amounts of infrastructure while still struggling to produce a stable political outcome afterward. Destruction and resolution are not the same process. Another complication begins to emerge as the conflict unfolds: humanitarian consequences. War rarely remains confined to purely military targets. Civilian populations inevitably become entangled in the conflict's ripple effects. Infrastructure failures disrupt everyday life. Hospitals, schools, and residential areas become part of the environment in which military operations take place. When incidents involving civilians occur, the political consequences can be profound. Reports have surfaced raising questions about specific strikes and their outcomes. According to reporting by Reuters, the Pentagon has examined whether outdated targeting data may have contributed to a deadly strike involving a girls' school in Iran. Investigations like that matter for reasons that extend beyond the immediate tragedy. They shape international opinion, they influence diplomatic relations, they generate pressure within domestic political systems. Every modern war unfolds not only on the battlefield, but also within a global information environment. Images spread instantly, narratives form quickly. Governments must respond not only to military realities, but also to the reactions of allies, adversaries, and international institutions. This creates another layer of complexity. Even if military operations achieve many of their tactical objectives, the political environment surrounding those operations can become increasingly unstable. And that instability makes the question of how the war ends even more important. Because eventually, every conflict reaches a moment where continuation becomes more costly than resolution. That moment may arrive because of domestic political pressure. It may arrive because of diplomatic intervention. It may arrive because the military objectives have reached the limits of what force alone can accomplish. When that moment comes, leaders must be able to articulate what success actually looks like. If that definition already exists, the transition can occur relatively smoothly. Negotiations can begin, ceasefires can be arranged, new deterrent structures can be established. But if the definition of victory has never been clearly established, the situation becomes far more complicated, because suddenly the question changes. Instead of asking how to achieve victory, leaders must explain why the conflict is ending without the original promises being fully realized. And that is where strategic ambiguity becomes politically dangerous. It becomes easier for critics to argue that the war accomplished less than advertised. It becomes harder for leaders to explain what was gained relative to the costs that were incurred. In other words, the challenge is not simply about military capability. The challenge is about narrative coherence. A war must have a beginning that makes sense, a strategy that connects actions to goals, and an ending that demonstrates those goals were achieved or at least meaningfully advanced. If any of those components becomes unclear, the perception of success begins to erode. Which brings us back to the central question. What if the explosions succeed? What if missile sites are destroyed, military facilities damaged, and retaliation reduced? Those outcomes might represent real tactical achievements, but strategy demands something more. Strategy demands that the actions taken during the war clearly connect to a stable political outcome afterward. Without that connection, military victories can begin to resemble something else. They start to look like movement without direction. And that is why the most important question in this conflict is not whether the United States or Israel possess the power to continue striking. Of course they do. The real strategic question is much more difficult. What happens if the explosions win the battles, but the strategy never clearly defines what winning the war actually means? And even more importantly, what happens if that definition has to be invented after the moment when it is already time to leave?